Good morning. Good evening to you, boss. I'm Disaster, and this is Disaster on the Radio, your digital safe haven where we dissect the absolute darkest corners of reality. Tonight, I have 3 terrifying, distinct tales lined up for you, culminating in a journey that will test the very limits of your sanity. But before we step into the icy shadows of our first entry, I have to ask you a question. Have you ever wondered what happens when the thing resting on the mortician's steel table isn't actually dead, but merely incubating something far worse under its skin, waiting patiently in the dark for the warmth of a living human to finish its cycle? Winter 1974, St. Jude Memorial Hospital, upstate New York. My name is Edward, and in the harsh, freezing winter of 1974, I worked as a senior night shift mortuary technician in the sub-basement of St. Jude Memorial Hospital in upstate New York. The basement smelled perpetually of raw carbolic acid, rusting iron drainage troughs, and the suffocating, thick dampness of wall mold that never quite dried, settling deep into the back of your throat with every breath you drew. Overhead, the ancient fluorescent light tubes flickered with a weak, dying pulse, filling the cold room with a relentless, low-frequency electrical hum that grated on your nerves hour after hour and cast jittery, distorted shadows across the silent prep tables. It was 20 minutes past 2 in the morning when the hydraulic lift groaned loudly from the delivery bay, signaling an unscheduled intake brought in by the state police. 2 orderlies pulled a heavy wooden transport box into my prep room, their thick rubber boots squeaking harshly against the cracked, discolored linoleum floor as they struggled under the impossible weight of the pine crate. The body inside was unidentified, recovered from the deepest, flooded shaft of an abandoned coal mine on the outskirts of town, sealed entirely within a thick, foul-smelling shell of glossy black wax that gleamed wetly under the sickly light. A waterlogged police tag hung from the wooden crate, carrying a stern warning typed in faded red ink, "Do not dissect. Do not open chest cavity. Await state pathologist." The orderlies left without speaking a single word, their faces pale, hollow, and drawn as they retreated rapidly up the concrete stairwell, leaving me completely alone with the electrical humming of the lamps and the bulky, black form on the slab. I approached the table, my boots crunching faintly on the dry salt spread over the concrete to absorb tracking moisture, river silt, and heavy condensation dripping from the rusty overhead pipes. The shape beneath the black wax was unnatural, unusually wide across the shoulders, yet compressed around the midsection as if the ribs had been crushed inward under immense, impossible weight before the waxy shell had hardened around it. A thick, dark oil was oozing slowly from microscopic cracks in the waxy shell, dripping onto the stainless steel tray with a wet, heavy splatter that echoed with terrifying clarity through the quiet chamber. I picked up a pair of heavy surgical shears from the tray, the cold metal biting into my gloved fingers through the thick latex as my hands trembled slightly. The official instructions were clear, but isolation in a silent morgue breeds a dangerous type of curiosity that feeds on the dark and pushes a man to ignore basic professional caution. I drove the steel tip into the outer waxy layer, watching the black shell split open with a wet tearing sound to release a plume of hot, stagnant air that made my eyes water behind my safety goggles and filled the room with the stench of ancient earth. The flesh exposed beneath the shell was not the pale gray of a mine victim, it was an oily, mottled indigo, weeping a clear, viscous liquid that hissed softly as it touched the cold metal table, slowly eroding the polished steel surface right before my eyes. The absolute silence of the subterranean prep room was punctuated only by the sharp, electric whine of the heavy bone saw as its circular blade cut through the dense, waxy shell covering the corpse's torso, sending vibrations rattling through my aching wrists. I adjusted the overhead surgical lamp, pulling the heavy brass arm down until the harsh, focused beam locked directly onto the exposed, indigo chest of the miner, casting long, dramatic shadows against the dark tile walls. The material was unnaturally dense, resisting the high-speed rotation of the steel teeth and spraying fine, black wax dust across my rubber apron, safety goggles, and the clean floor tiles. Driven by a dangerous, professional compulsion to understand what had preserved this body in the deep shaft, I ignored the police warnings and pressed the scalpel firmly into the dead man's abdomen. I expected the cold resistance of frozen tissue, or the release of trapped decomposition gases, but the blade cut through the indigo skin as if it were soft, waterlogged leather, yielding without any natural anatomical resistance. There was no spray of arterial blood, nor any dark, coagulated sludge typically found in fatal crushing accidents that occur deep underground. Instead, a thick, jet-black steam erupted from the open wound, venting into the cold prep room with a sudden, blistering hiss that filled the air with the suffocating smell of scorched sulfur and burning petroleum. The black vapor burned my eyes through my goggles and made my throat constrict violently, forcing me to take 3 hasty steps back from the operating slab while coughing uncontrollably into my sleeve. Before the steam could dissipate under the ventilation hood, the dead tissues around the incision began to twitch, swell, and ripple in a sickening, rhythmic pulse that defied every law of post-mortem physics. The black fibers beneath the skin were moving independently, expanding outward like living roots stretching toward the light, feeding on the cool, oxygen-rich air of the basement. The edges of the wound gaped open, and the black wax shell surrounding the body began to fracture with a series of sharp, metallic snaps that echoed off the yellowed wall tiles like gunshot reports in a sealed chamber. I grabbed the suction hose to clear the black fluid oozing from the incision, but the rubber tip melted into a soft, useless sludge the second it touched the acidic liquid, releasing a sharp tang of chemical heat. The corpse's chest cavity flared open like the mouth of a dark vault, exposing a mass of thick, pulsating black tendrils that had completely consumed and replaced the internal organs over decades of subterranean dormancy. I dropped the scalpel, the steel tool clattering loudly against the concrete floor as I backed toward the instrument cabinet, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs in pure, unadulterated terror. The body was not rotting, it was serving as an incubator for a synthetic, biological growth that was waking up from its long slumber in the dark mine shaft, using the corpse as mere fuel for its arrival. The black tendrils pulled air into the cavity with a low, raspy sound, stretching upward from the dead chest like blind, searching fingers eager to grasp the surrounding atmosphere and establish a hold on the world above. Every breath of cold basement air seemed to accelerate the growth, causing the black fibers to harden into thick, calcified structures that pushed the ribcage completely apart with a horrifying series of wet, snapping sounds. I reached blindly for the emergency phone on the brick wall, my hand trembling so violently that I knocked the plastic receiver off its hook, sending it dangling uselessly by its coiled cord while the thing on the table continued to expand toward me in the dim light. The heavy steel blast doors of the morgue froze shut as a sudden, intense chill swept through the room, coating the metal handles and concrete walls in a thick layer of glittering white frost that crackled in the suffocating quiet of the subterranean vault. A viscous, black liquid began to seep out from the base of the operating table, spreading across the floor tiles in long, spiderwebbing lines that clung to the walls and crept rapidly toward the only exit like living, hungry shadows. Before I could reach the door, several thick, black fibers shot out from the corpse's open chest cavity with the speed of striking vipers, locking onto my lower left arm with a wet, heavy impact that shattered my restraint. I screamed as the cold, barbed tendrils tore through my heavy rubber gloves and cut deep into my flesh, anchoring themselves directly into the muscle tissue of my forearm like iron hooks sunk deep into fresh meat. I pulled back with all my weight, my rubber boots slipping uselessly in the black slime, but the strength behind the black fibers was inhuman, dragging me inch by inch toward the edge of the blood-stained operating table. The pain was agonizing, a freezing, searing sensation that burned through my nervous system as the fibers began to move beneath my skin, threading themselves along my veins with deliberate, terrifying speed toward my heart. I grabbed the heavy surgical cleaver from the scattered instrument tray with my free right hand and brought the heavy blade down with wild, frantic force onto the taut tendrils holding me captive. The steel edge struck the black fibers with a sickening, dull thud, but the blade bounced off the calcified tissue without leaving a single mark or cutting a single strand of the organic cable binding us together. The entity let out a high-pitched, harmonic vibration that rattled the glass jars on the medicine shelves, causing the dead fluorescent light tubes overhead to burst in a shower of sharp sparks and shattered glass that rained over the room. The prep room was plunged into near darkness, illuminated only by the faint, oily sheen of the black fluid covering the floor and walls, which cast a sickly, phosphorescent glow across the chamber like a dying star. I felt the black fibers traveling up my arm, passing my elbow and creeping toward my shoulder with terrifying speed, turning the skin over my veins a dark, mottled indigo as my blood turned to thick, stagnant sludge. My fingers locked into rigid, useless claws as the synthetic organism converted my muscle tissue into the same petrified, fibrous mass that filled the miner's chest, stripping away my humanity inch by inch until nothing remained. I fell to my knees on the ice-covered floor, sobbing and gasping for air as the coldness spread into my chest, paralyzing my diaphragm and stifling my screams into low, wet groans that echoed uselessly off the frozen concrete walls. The entity on the table leaned over the edge, its black, waxy face splitting open along the jawline to expose a cavernous, toothless maw that exhaled a thick cloud of sulfurous gas directly into my face, blinding me completely. The tendrils pulled my face down against the cold, indigo skin of the corpse's chest, stitching our bodies together with hundreds of glowing, black threads that pierced through my clothes and skin without resistance, merging us into one. I could feel my heart slowing down, its natural rhythm being overridden by the powerful, slow thrumming of the black core pulsing inside the dead man's ribs, synchronizing our flesh into a single, terrifying mass of living death. The darkness in my mind deepened as the fibers reached my neck, cutting off the flow of blood to my brain and replacing my thoughts with a vast, cold silence that smelled of deep earth, ancient stone, and forgotten graves. My right hand dropped the surgical cleaver, the metal tool sinking into the thick, black slime pooling on the floor as my entire body went completely rigid under the weight of the growth, becoming nothing more than another vessel for the subterranean horror waiting in the dark forever, locked away from the sunlight for eternity. The subterranean prep room was bathed in total, suffocating darkness, filled only by the sickening, wet sound of snapping bone and restructuring tissue as the transformation reached its climax. Under the cold, unyielding concrete of the hospital foundation, the two bodies fused completely into a single, petrified mass of black wax and calcified indigo fiber. My consciousness was stripped away piece by piece, replaced by the collective, unyielding instinct of the black core that had waited decades in the dark shaft of the abandoned coal mine. I could no longer feel the coldness of the floor, the fracture in my collarbone, or the agony of the tendrils burrowing through my nervous system. There was only the heavy, rhythmic pulsing of the new biological engine resting where my chest used to be, circulating the dark, sulfurous oil through my hardened veins. The black wax expanded, wrapping around my limbs, my torso, and my face like a heavy, protective cocoon that hardened into volcanic basalt within minutes. My jaw was pulled wide, my facial muscles stretched and locked into a permanent, grotesque grin that split my skin from ear to ear under the smooth, glossy shell. Hours passed in the absolute quiet of the sealed vault, time losing all meaning as the city above slept through the freezing winter night. When the morning maintenance crew finally used a crowbar to force open the rusted steel doors at 7 o'clock, the smell of carbolic acid and old bleach was completely gone from the prep room. The air was heavy, warm, and thick with the scent of petroleum, damp earth, and burnt sulfur that made the workers cough and cover their faces with their sleeves. The first maintenance man stepped into the room, his flashlight beam cutting through the settling black dust to sweep across the ruined floor tiles and scattered tools. The primary operating table sat completely bare, its stainless steel surface corroded and pitted by deep, chemical burns that had eaten straight through the metal. On the second table, illuminated by the harsh white beam of the flashlight, lay a massive, petrified form wrapped entirely in a thick, seamless shell of glossy black wax. The body was unnaturally still, its limbs smooth and rigid, but its face carried the clear, unmistakable features of Edward, the night technician who had taken the shift 12 hours before. His eyes were sealed shut beneath the translucent black material, but his lips were drawn back into a sharp, carved smile that stretched unnaturally wide across his cheeks. There were no signs of a struggle in the room, no blood on the floor, and no trace of the miner's corpse that had been delivered in the pine crate at midnight. Only the single, black waxy figure remained on the steel slab, its hardened surface reflecting the morning sunlight trickling down the concrete stairwell with a cold, glassy sheen. And as the maintenance crew backed out of the room in silent horror, the low, electrical hum of the broken fluorescent lights was replaced by a soft, rhythmic thrumming deep within the black chest. The black shell on the table began to vibrate with a faint, imperceptible pulse, drawing heat from the cool air of the room as its smooth surface settled into place. Deep beneath the hardened waxy layer, the newly formed heart beat once, twice, a slow, heavy rhythm that echoed through the hollow steel legs of the slab and into the stone foundation below. The chief engineer took a hesitant step back toward the open doorway, his hand trembling as he reached for his two-way radio to call the administrative office upstairs. Before he could depress the talk button, a hairline fracture appeared along the center of the black chest, spreading upward toward the neck with a series of sharp, dry snaps that sounded like breaking ice. A thin, dark vapor began to curl out from the narrow fissure, carrying with it a suffocating wave of intense heat that caused the frost on the surrounding walls to melt into running streams of water. The maintenance crew scrambled up the concrete stairwell in blind panic, slamming the heavy iron fire door behind them and bolting the external latch from the outside. Inside the pitch-black vault, the black form on the slate slab shifted its weight, its petrified fingers uncurling one by one as the new entity prepared to step out into the daylight. The endless, towering pines of the Mount Hood National Forest look like jagged black teeth against the stormy Oregon sky when you're driving a 50-ton rig at 3 in the morning. My name is Mark, and in the wet, freezing autumn of 1991, I was a long-haul trucker driving a heavy 18-wheeler loaded with processed timber along Highway 26. The rain was falling in relentless, heavy sheets, slamming against the wide windshield of my cab. Inside the cabin, the heater was humming loudly, blowing lukewarm air that smelled of cold coffee, stale tobacco, and wet canvas across my worn leather seats. The windshield wipers beat a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the glass, thump-thump, thump-thump, doing little to clear the thick wall of water cascading down from the mountain pine canopy. At precisely kilometer marker 40, an isolated stretch of road far beyond the reach of local radio stations or emergency call boxes, my headlights caught a tall silhouette standing on the narrow shoulder. The figure was wrapped in a bright yellow, rubberized raincoat that gleamed wetly under my fog lights, standing motionless beside the highway with a single, heavy canvas tool bag resting at his boots. He didn't stick out his thumb or wave his arms frantically like a stranded motorist, he simply stood there, his face buried deep within the shadow of his heavy hood, staring directly at my grill. Common sense told me to keep my foot on the accelerator and leave the stranger to the Oregon rain, but the freezing mountain air and an empty highway can make a man merciful against his better judgment. I pulled the air brake lever with a heavy mechanical hiss, bringing the massive truck to a slow, squealing stop 20 yards past the yellow coat. The passenger side door opened almost immediately, letting in a sudden, icy gust of wind and rain that made the papers on my dashboard fly across the cab. The man climbed up the high metal steps without saying a word, hauling his heavy canvas bag onto the floorboards with a dull, metallic thud that shook the passenger seat. He pulled the heavy door shut, sealing us back inside the warm, cramped cabin as dark, muddy water began to pool around his heavy work boots. The hood of his yellow coat was pulled so low that I couldn't see his eyes, only a sharp, pale jawline covered in light stubble and a thin, tight mouth that didn't move. "Rough night to be walking mile 40, buddy," I said, shifting the heavy transmission back into gear and pulling the 18-wheeler back onto the dark asphalt. The stranger didn't reply, he simply sat rigid in the passenger seat, his wet yellow coat dripping dark water onto the floorboards while his hand remained resting flat on the canvas bag between his feet. The silence inside the cab grew thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the engine's roar and the rhythmic beating of the wipers against the wet glass. I glanced sideways every few seconds, watching the shadow of his hood, but he didn't turn his head or acknowledge my presence in any way. The temperature in the truck seemed to drop steadily, despite the heater blowing on full strength, until my own breath began to form thin, white clouds in the air. I looked down at the floorboards, noticing that the water pooling around his work boots wasn't clear rainwater. It was a dark, oily sludge that carried the bitter, copper stench of dried blood. My hands tightened on the worn vinyl steering wheel as a cold knot of dread began to form deep in my stomach. Miles of empty, pitch-black highway stretched out ahead of us. I reached out slowly toward the CB radio mounted on the dashboard, hoping to click the receiver and contact any other driver in the area. Before my fingers could touch the plastic microphone, the stranger's hand shot out from beneath his yellow sleeve, pinning my wrist to the dashboard with an icy, ironclad grip. His skin felt as cold as a frozen lake, devoid of any warmth or pulse, his thick fingers digging into my flesh until my arm went entirely numb. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head toward me, the deep shadow beneath his yellow hood shifting to reveal two pale, milky eyes that stared right through me with complete indifference. "Leave the radio alone, Mark," he whispered, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping over concrete, calling me by the name printed on my trucker's cap. "Just keep driving down the mountain, we have a long way to go before the sun comes up." The heavy canvas bag between his boots gave a sudden, wet jerk, as if something living and restless was struggling to break free from the thick cloth inside. The stranger didn't even look down at the bag, he simply tightened his grip on my arm, forcing my eyes back onto the dark, rain-soaked road ahead as the mountain trees closed in around us like a fortress of stone and shadow. The pale orange glow of the dashboard lights cast long, distorted shadows across the cramped interior of the cab as the heavy 18-wheeler climbed the steep, winding grade of Highway 26. The stranger remained completely silent for 10 long miles, his body sitting rigid, staring straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield into the dark, suffocating wall of mountain pines. The sound of the autumn storm slamming against the aluminum roof was deafening, mixed with the deep, throaty roar of the diesel engine straining under 50 tons of processed timber. Inside the cabin, the heavy smell of damp wool, cold coffee, and stale tobacco was rapidly giving way to a sharp, chemical stench that seemed to emanate directly from the dark water pooling around the passenger's boots. "Where are you headed?" I asked, keeping my left hand firm on the chrome steering wheel while my right hand rested casually on the long gear shift lever between us. The man slowly turned his head toward me, the movement so smooth and deliberate it felt entirely mechanical, like a display mannequin rotating on a wooden pedestal. Under the dim orange glow of the oil pressure gauge, I could finally see his face clearly beneath the dripping hood of his yellow raincoat. His skin was unnaturally pale, stretched tightly across a sharp jawline, and his eyes were flat, dark, and completely devoid of any human warmth or flickering emotion. They reflected the passing yellow road lines like polished spheres of cold glass, unblinking even as violent gusts of wind shuddered through the heavy frame of the cab. "I go where the work is, Mark," he said, his voice flat, dry, and terrifyingly calm, carrying a hollow cadence that didn't match the heavy storm raging outside. My heart skipped a beat, a cold knot tightening instantly in my stomach. I had never introduced myself, and there was no name tag on my flannel shirt or logbook visible on the dashboard. Before my mind could process the error, the stranger leaned down with agonizing slowness and unzipped the heavy canvas tool bag resting between his muddy boots. The sound of metal tools sliding against one another filled the cabin, a sharp, cold clinking that cut cleanly through the roar of the engine and the thunder overhead. He didn't pull out a set of wrenches, an iron jack, or a roadside flare, his pale, thick fingers wrapped tightly around the worn wooden handle of a broad-bladed butcher's cleaver. The whiter steel edge was pitted, stained with patches of dark, dry grease, and polished to a razor-sharp finish along the front lip. He lifted the heavy tool into the narrow space between our seats, holding it with the casual, effortless familiarity of a veteran butcher preparing his workstation. "Do you know how much pressure it takes to cut through a bull's spine, Mark?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave into a low, sickening whisper that vibrated inside my ears. "You have to strike right between the second and third vertebrae, where the cartilage is soft, otherwise, the heavy steel blade jams deep in the bone, and the prime meat gets completely spoiled." A cold panic surged through my veins, and I slammed my boot down onto the brake pedal to lock the wheels, but the stranger reacted with terrifying, predatory speed. He lunged across the center console, bringing the broad meat cleaver down in a blinding arc that split the air inside the cramped cab. The steel blade struck my right forearm where it rested on the gear shift lever, biting deep through my heavy flannel sleeve and shattering the underlying bone with a sickening crunch. Blood erupted from the gash, spraying hot and crimson across the orange dashboard gauges, the windshield, and my face, completely blinding me for a crucial second. I let out a strangled scream of pure agony as my right hand instantly went limp, losing all sensation and control over the transmission lever. With the engine screaming at high RPMs and the driver's side wheel locked in a violent turn, the heavy 18-wheeler lurched out of control, the massive trailer behind us jackknifing on the wet asphalt and plowing toward the edge of the mountain cliff. The cab of the heavy 18-wheeler violently pitched from side to side as the tires lost all purchase on the slick, rain-drenched asphalt, the massive 50-ton load of timber behind us physically shoving the entire vehicle toward the jagged guardrail. I screamed in raw, unadulterated agony, my right forearm still pinned to the gear shift console by the broad, heavy blade of the meat cleaver, fresh arterial blood spurting rhythmically over the dashboard and coating the steering wheel in a slippery, dark red sheen. Using my only remaining functional hand, I grabbed the wheel with wild, desperate strength, struggling to keep the massive, lumbering rig from plunging over the side of the narrow mountain road into the black, silent gorge that yawned below. The stranger didn't flinch as the truck bounced violently over the gravel shoulder, his face remained perfectly serene, his features illuminated only by the frantic, bright flashes of white sparks flying off the grinding metal frame beneath us. He reached into the deep pocket of his yellow rain jacket with his free hand, pulling out a long, narrow hunting knife with a polished steel blade that gleamed maliciously in the low orange light of the cab. "You shouldn't fight the skid, Mark," he whispered, leaning over me with unnatural calm, his cold breath smelling faintly of copper, wet pine, and stagnant earth as he brought the point of the knife down toward my exposed thigh. He drove the blade deep into my right leg, twisting the handle with cold, clinical precision that sent waves of blinding, white-hot agony shooting up my spine and flooding into my brain. I bellowed in a mix of pure rage and insurmountable pain, momentarily releasing my grip on the steering wheel to strike him squarely across the jaw with my elbow, the heavy impact snapping his head back against the shattered passenger window. His grip on the hunting knife loosened just enough for me to yank my bleeding leg away, my heavy boot slamming against his chest to shove his massive body back toward the open passenger door. The truck slammed into the rusted steel guardrail with a deafening, high-pitched metallic screech that shattered the remaining side mirrors and sent showers of orange sparks flying across the hood of the truck. The stranger laughed, a low, dry, rasping chuckle that sounded like dead autumn leaves sliding across dry stone, as he lunged back toward me, completely ignoring the thick trail of blood dripping from his split lip. He grabbed my throat with his left hand, his iron fingers squeezing my windpipe shut while he pulled the meat cleaver free from my right forearm with a sickening, wet-wrenching sound. Blood gushed from my open arm wound, spraying across the windshield and blinding my view of the road as I fought to draw a single, jagged breath, my vision swimming with bright, pulsating red spots. My fingers clawed frantically at his eyes, my nails catching the edge of the hood of his yellow raincoat and ripping the stiff fabric back to reveal a mass of dark, jagged, raised scars covering his entire scalp, as if his skull had been shattered and painstakingly pieced back together after a fatal accident years ago. The trailer behind us buckled completely under the physics of the crash, the massive iron hitch snapping with a sound like a cannon shot as the heavy timber load broke free, tumbling down the embankment into the dark trees below. The cab flipped onto its side, the passenger door tearing completely open as we plunged headfirst off the edge of Highway 26, falling into the pitch-black, silent void of the Oregon Ravine. The world went weightless for 3 agonizing seconds, the roar of the engine suddenly swallowed by the rushing mountain wind as the overturned truck sheared through the upper branches of ancient pine trees. Metal twisted violently around us, the safety glass of the front windshield shattering into thousands of tiny, razor-sharp cubes that rained over our tumbling bodies in the dark. We slammed into the rocky ravine floor with a bone-shattering impact that crushed the steel roof of the cab flat against the tops of the vinyl seats. The darkness that followed was heavy and immediate, filled with the thick smell of spilled diesel fuel, hot oil, and steam rising from the cracked radiator into the freezing night air. I lay trapped in the mangled wreckage, my ribs crushed and my breath coming in short, bloody gasps as rainwater began to pool around my bruised face. Through the haze of pain, I heard a wet, metallic scraping sound 3 feet away, the stranger pushing aside a heavy sheet of crushed metal as he crawled effortlessly out of the ruined cab, his yellow coat completely untouched by the carnage. The violent impact of the heavy cab slamming into the rocky floor of the deep ravine echoed through the dark mountain valley like a localized earthquake, crushing the metal frame like an aluminum can under an iron boot. Ancient pines snapped like brittle twigs as the 18-wheeler tumbled repeatedly through the dense canopy, metal ripping away, tires exploding, and safety glass shattering into thousands of lethal fragments that filled the tumbling interior. When the crushed cab finally came to a complete halt upside down against a massive granite boulder, the silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the hiss of steam escaping the ruptured radiator and the steady, heavy drip of diesel fuel onto hot engine metal. I was pinned tightly beneath the crushed roof and the bent steering column, my ribs fractured, my leg useless, and my right arm bleeding heavily into the wet dirt that had flooded through the shattered windshield. The suffocating smell of raw diesel fumes filled the narrow space, mixing with the sharp, copper stench of my own blood pooling beneath my chest on the upturned ceiling fabric. Through the haze of blinding pain and fading consciousness, I saw a deliberate movement near the broken passenger window, a bright yellow rubber coat moving through the twisted metal without a single sign of injury, panic, or hesitation. The stranger pulled himself free from the wreckage with smooth, liquid motion, stepping onto the muddy forest floor with slow, deliberate movements, completely unbothered by the crushing impact that had broken my body to pieces. He reached down into the mud to pick up his heavy canvas tool bag, wiping a thin layer of dark dirt from the smooth handle of his broad meat cleaver before sliding the blade back inside the bag. He turned back toward the crushed driver's side, leaning his pale, scarred face through the shattered window frame to look down at me as I gasped for air through my fractured chest. He didn't offer a final taunt, a psychotic smile, or a dramatic gesture. His flat, dark eyes were completely vacant, staring at my dying form with the cold, detached interest of a butcher checking a hanging carcass before the end of his shift. "Thanks for the ride, Mark," he said softly, his dry voice remarkably clear and completely untouched by the extreme violence of the mountain crash. He turned away without looking back and began walking into the dark, rain-drenched depths of the Mount Hood National Forest, his yellow coat gleaming faintly under the weak starlight before disappearing entirely into the pine shadows. A tiny spark from the severed battery cables caught the expanding puddle of leaking diesel fuel near my head, igniting a bright, sudden orange flame that spread rapidly across the overturned dashboard. The fire roared to life within seconds, crawling over the dry leather upholstery and engulfing my legs in a wall of intense, searing heat that cut cleanly through the numbness of my broken spine. I closed my eyes, my lungs filling with thick, poisonous black smoke as the roaring flames completely consumed the crushed wreckage of the truck, sealing my story beneath the wet, silent canopy of Mile 40. When the state police, forestry rangers, and highway rescue teams finally reached the crash site at dawn, they found only the charred, unrecognizable iron frame of the cab resting against the granite boulder. Inside the incinerated wreckage lay my burned remains, fused permanently to the melted steering column beneath several tons of cold mountain mud and ruined timber. No second body was ever recovered from the ravine, and no set of footprints was found leading away from the fire through the rain-swept floor of the ancient Oregon woods. The official crash report filed by the county sheriff listed the incident as an isolated driver fatigue accident caused by severe weather and lost traction on the steep mountain grade. Yet for decades after, long-haul truckers rolling down Highway 26 in the dead of winter reported seeing a tall silhouette in a bright yellow raincoat standing at mile 40, holding a heavy canvas bag and waiting silently for the next rig to stop in the dark. The Sonoran Desert at midnight is a vast, empty sea of black stone and sand where the highway lines stretch into infinity without a single town or streetlight to break the suffocating void. My name is Sammy, and in the summer of 1988, I was a night shift long-haul trucker driving a heavy flatbed rig across the barren stretches of Interstate 10 in southern Arizona. The desert air outside was bone-dry and freezing, whistling through the aluminum cab of my truck as I drove 60 miles an hour through the absolute darkness. Inside the cabin, the red glow of the dashboard gauges illuminated my tired face, reflecting off the glass of the CB radio mounted above my head near the rearview mirror. The radio had been pure static all night, producing only a low, rhythmic white noise that helped keep me awake on the long, hypnotic stretches between Phoenix and the California border. At precisely midnight, the needle on the CB radio dial began to jump erratically, snapping away from the standard channels and locking firmly onto channel 13. The white noise instantly died away, replaced by a deep, unnatural hum that vibrated through the metal frame of the cab and made the glass windows buzz in their rubber seals. Through the small speaker came a voice, not a fellow trucker sharing road conditions or a local dispatcher, but the soft, high-pitched voice of my 8-year-old son, Toby. Toby had died 4 years earlier in a hospital bed in Tucson, his small heart giving out after a long, agonizing battle with childhood leukemia that had left my life in ruined pieces. "Daddy." The voice whispered through the static, perfectly clear and devoid of any radio interference. "I'm sitting by the burned mesquite tree at mile 113. Please stop for me, Daddy, it's so cold out here." My hand froze on the steering wheel, my heart slamming into my throat as tears instantly welled up in my eyes, blinding me to the empty black asphalt stretching out ahead. I reached up with a trembling hand to switch the channel dial, but the plastic knob was locked tight, as if fused in place by an invisible, solid force inside the casing. "Toby." I gasped into the plastic CB microphone, my voice cracking with 4 years of buried grief and sheer disbelief. "Toby, is that really you? Please stop the truck, Daddy," the speaker repeated, the voice carrying a strange, rhythmic cadence that sounded less like a child and more like a rehearsed prayer spoken by a choir of distant shadows. Up ahead, illuminated by the harsh white beams of my high beams, a solitary, blackened mesquite tree stood alone on the sandy shoulder of mile 113, its twisted branches reaching toward the dark desert sky like skeletal arms. Sitting on a flat rock directly beneath the burnt branches was the small, distinct shape of a child wrapped in an oversized winter coat, holding his knees tightly against his chest in the freezing night wind. My instincts screamed at me that this was mathematically impossible, that my mind was playing cruel tricks on me after hours of dark asphalt, but grief is a blind, hungry thing that destroys logic in an instant. I slammed my boot onto the brake pedal, the tires screaming against the cold asphalt as 50 tons of steel skidded to a violent halt on the dusty shoulder, kicking up a massive cloud of white sand. I threw the transmission into neutral and yanked the emergency brake, practically tearing the cab door open as I threw myself down into the freezing desert air. "Toby!" I shouted, my boots sinking into the loose gravel as I ran frantically toward the shadow beneath the blackened tree, my breath clouding thick in the moonlight. "Toby, I'm here. Daddy's here." The small figure didn't move or look up as I approached, remaining perfectly still on the flat rock while the wind whipped through the dead mesquite branches above us with a low, mournful sigh. I fell to my knees in the dirt 3 feet away, reaching out with trembling, tear-stained hands to wrap my arms around my boy's shoulders and pull him close to my chest. The moment my fingers touched the fabric of the coat, my skin was hit with a jolt of unnatural, subterranean ice that turned my blood to absolute sludge. The figure didn't feel like a child. Beneath the thick cloth was something hard, dense, and unnaturally smooth, like polished basalt or frozen stone. Slowly, the figure's head tilted upward, the hood falling back to reveal not the soft face of my dead son, but a pale, featureless wooden mask carved with two hollow black eye sockets that stared back into my soul with complete, empty hunger. From inside the wooden mouth came a wet, clicking sound, followed by the metallic voice of the CB radio speaking directly into my mind. "Thank you for stopping, Sammy, the desert has been waiting so long for a new voice." The temperature inside the cab dropped so rapidly that my breath instantly turned to thick clouds of white frost, freezing the inside of the windshield with a thin layer of deep red ice. I slammed my foot onto the brake pedal, bringing the heavy flatbed rig to a skidding stop on the gravel shoulder right beside the charred, skeletal trunk of the mesquite tree. The CB radio speaker hummed with a low, harmonic vibration that made my teeth ache and filled the cab with the smell of old copper, dried flowers, and stagnant river water. "I'm here, Toby," I cried out, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for the chrome door handle to step out into the freezing desert air. Before my hand could touch the handle, a sudden, heavy shift in weight pressed down on the worn mattress of the sleeper berth located directly behind my driver's seat. I froze in place, my blood turning to liquid ice as I slowly turned my head to look into the small rearview mirror mounted on the windshield. Sitting in the dim red light of the sleeper berth was not my son, but a tall, emaciated figure wrapped in a dark, rotting shroud that smelled of ancient graves and dry desert earth. Its face was completely smooth, devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth, but its pale, bone-white head tilted slowly toward me as if inspecting my reflection in the glass. In its long, needle-thin fingers, it held a heavy pendant carved from a yellowed human bone, suspended from a thick cord of braided black hair that hung down to its knees. The voice did not come from the CB radio speaker anymore. It resonated directly inside the center of my skull, echoing through my mind with the terrifying clarity of a funeral bell ringing in an empty church. "You have driven far enough, Sammy." The voice chanted in my mind, speaking with Toby's delicate voice overlaid with 100 ancient, raspy whispers that made my brain throb with agony. "The asphalt you travel on tonight does not lead to California. It is the long, unbroken road of those who died behind the wheel, and you crossed the threshold 20 miles ago." I looked frantically out the side windows, but the desert landscape was gone. The sand, the saguaro cactuses, and the distant mountains had vanished, replaced by an endless, smooth sea of pitch-black asphalt that stretched out in every direction under a sky without stars. The headlights of my truck cut through the void, illuminating nothing but the yellow center lines of a highway that had no exits, no signs, and no end. The pale entity in the back leaned forward, its cold, bone-like fingers reaching over the top of my leather seat to rest gently upon my left shoulder, sending a paralyzing numbness through my entire body. My muscles locked into rigid stone, my hand frozen against the door handle as the ice spreading from its fingers crept up my neck and into my jaw, stealing my ability to scream or draw breath. I tried to force my foot down onto the gas pedal, to crash the rig into the void and end whatever nightmare had consumed me, but my lower limbs belonged entirely to the creature behind me now. In the reflection of the mirror, the entity's smooth, featureless face began to fracture along the center, cracking open to reveal a single, burning iris that glowed with the cold, pale blue light of an oncoming high beam. "Look closely at the asphalt, Sammy," the voice resonated inside my head, softer now, almost comforting in its absolute finality. I looked down through the clear floorboards beneath my feet, where the dark highway was rushing past at terrifying speed even though the speedometer sat dead at 0. Embedded beneath the glass-like surface of the road were thousands of pale, frozen faces staring up toward the truck's headlights, their mouths open in silent, eternal screams, their hands reaching upward through the tar. Among those frozen souls, tucked between two white lane markers directly beneath my driver's side tire, was my own face, pale, motionless, and covered in dried blood from a jackknife crash that had happened hours before I ever reached mile 113. The entity pulled the bone pendant tight, and as my vision dissolved into the black liquid of the road, the CB radio gave one last, crystal clear click, "Welcome home, Daddy." The touch of the entity's cold, bone-like fingers spread through my left shoulder like liquid nitrogen, freezing my muscle tissue instantly and turning my dark skin into a translucent, chalk-white substance that showed no living blood vessels beneath. I looked down at my trembling hands gripped tightly around the chrome steering wheel, watching in absolute horror as my fingers began to dissolve, turning into a fine, glowing white mist that drifted uselessly away into the dark cabin air. I tried with every remaining ounce of my strength to pull my arms back, to strike out at the entity in the sleeper berth, or to force open the driver's door and plunge out into the black void, but my body utterly refused to obey my brain's frantic commands. The heavy diesel engine of the flatbed rig was roaring violently, but the massive truck was moving entirely on its own now, accelerating down the endless, pitch-black highway at 80 miles an hour without my boots ever touching the gas pedal. The needle on the glowing speedometer spun rapidly past 90, past 100, pinning itself firmly against the far metallic stopper of the gauge while the yellow center lines of the road stretched out into long, unbroken ribbons of blinding light ahead. "Look into the mirror, Sammy," the voice chanted directly inside the center of my skull, terrifyingly gentle and smooth, vibrating through my jawbone and echoing off the enamel of my teeth. I forced my eyes upward toward the rearview mirror, watching in helplessness as the pale, shroud-wrapped entity reached over my seat and placed the heavy, yellowed bone pendant over my head, letting it rest cold against my white, dissolving chest. In the reflection of the glass, I could see dozens of shadowy figures sitting silently along the wide gravel shoulders of the endless road ahead, truckers, stranded travelers, and lost hitchhikers who had perished along Interstate 10 over the past several decades, standing in motionless rows beneath a starless sky. They were all wearing identical carved bone pendants, their faces pale, hollow, and featureless as they silently watched my heavy flatbed rig thunder past them into the eternal, unyielding darkness. I realized in that agonizing instant that there had been no sudden turn off the main interstate, no missed highway exit, and no miracle broadcast over Channel 13. The horrific rollover crash I had experienced 3 miles back near the rock quarry had taken my life long before my tires ever touched the shoulder at mile 113. My mortal life had ended instantly in a twisted heap of hot steel and shattered glass, and my fading mind had constructed the rest of this endless stretch of road simply to bridge the terrifying gap between the living world and the infinite dark below. "It's time to let go of the heavy wheel, Sammy," the voice whispered softly, Toby's innocent tone growing warmer and gentler until it sounded like a peaceful lullaby being sung at bedtime in a quiet home. "There are no more long night shifts, no more freezing desert roads, and no more crushing grief waiting for you at the end of the line." My arms dissolved completely into clouds of white mist, my chest fading away into the quiet, soothing void as the heavy flatbed rig merged seamlessly with the endless shadow landscape surrounding us. The roaring hum of the diesel engine died away into absolute silence, replaced only by the soft sound of a dry desert wind blowing across ancient stone, carrying my spirit out over the endless highway of the dead, where no truck would ever pass again. The dark, endless road began to melt away, turning into a serene, glowing expanse of pure, calm light that washed away every trace of terror and exhaustion. I felt the heavy weight of 4 years of crushing grief lift completely from my soul, replaced by a deep, impenetrable warmth that filled the void inside me. Beside me in the quiet white haze, Toby stood holding out his hand, his face bright and whole, entirely free from the pain of his long illness. I reached out with my restored hand, taking his warm fingers in mine as we turned our backs on the dark desert highway together. We walked into the quiet light side by side, leaving the cold iron cab and the endless asphalt far behind us in the desert shadows. Behind us, the silent highway faded completely into the void, its phantom lane markers dissolving into dust beneath the calm sky. No engine roared, no radio crackled, and the long, dark shift had finally come to its peaceful, eternal end. The infinite stretch of pitch-black asphalt began to dissolve at its edges, fading into a vast, silent expanse of desert sand illuminated only by the cold, distant light of a moonless night sky. The heavy roar of the flatbed's diesel engine had died completely, leaving behind a silence so absolute and profound that it felt like standing in the heart of an ancient, undisturbed tomb beneath the earth. I no longer felt the cold metal of the steering wheel beneath my hands, nor the weight of my own broken body, as my consciousness lifted entirely out of the dissolving cab and hovered over the desolate Arizona highway. Below, illuminated by the bright, flashing red and blue strobe lights of 3 state police cruisers, lay the crushed, smoking wreckage of my flatbed truck resting at the bottom of the rocky ravine near mile 113. The heavy trailer had jackknifed completely on the slick gravel, tearing through the rusted steel barrier and tumbling 70 feet down into the dry creek bed below. A team of state troopers and highway rescue workers stood around the twisted cab, their long flashlight beams cutting through the thick black smoke rising from the ruptured fuel tanks. They were pulling a blanket over a still form crushed beneath the steering column, a man whose face was peaceful, pale, and entirely free from the pain and exhaustion that had plagued his life for 4 long years. On the dashboard of the ruined truck, illuminated by the flickering flames near the engine bay, the small glass screen of the CB radio glowed faintly red, its channel dial still locked tightly onto channel 13. A state trooper reached into the shattered driver's side window with a heavy leather glove, clicking off the master power switch to prevent an electrical fire from sparking the leaking diesel fuel. As the red power light faded to black, a single, soft line of static whispered through the small speaker one final time, a child's gentle laugh echoing out into the vast, freezing desert air before fading forever into complete silence. Miles away from the crash site, long-haul truckers driving down Interstate 10 under the dark Sonoran sky reported unusual interference on their radios at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning. Whenever their channel dials brushed past channel 13, the harsh white noise would briefly give way to a soft, rhythmic hum that sounded like a heavy engine coasting along an empty stretch of road. Some drivers claimed they heard a man's tired voice thanking his son for leading him home, while others reported seeing the faint silhouette of an 18-wheeler driving alongside them in the midnight fog, its headlights shining bright and white, casting no shadows on the sand before vanishing into the dark. The road had claimed another traveler, taking him away from the endless night shifts, the freezing mountain passes, and the heavy burden of lost memories, guiding his spirit far beyond the reach of any highway map or radio tower. And as the sun began to rise over the jagged peaks of the Arizona mountains, burning away the cold desert frost and the lingering black smoke of the wreckage, the asphalt lay quiet, empty, and still, waiting silently for the next lone driver to tune in to the forgotten static of the radio. The first rays of dawn touched the cold metal of the ruined rig, casting long, pale shadows across the quiet canyon floor. Nearby, a lone desert fox paused at the edge of the creek bed, sniffing the crisp morning air before disappearing silently into the cacti. The highway above slowly returned to its routine rhythm, with distant engines humming as early morning commuters began their long journeys down the coast. Yet the memory of Channel 13 lingered in the quiet air, a ghost story carried on the wind across the Sonoran expanse. For those who listen closely late at night, the static still carries a gentle, lingering warmth, a soft reminder of a father and son finally reunited beyond the final exit. Good morning, or good evening to you, boss. This has been Disaster on the Radio. Tonight, we traversed through the icy morgue vaults of New York, down the blood-stained mountain grades of Oregon, and onto the infinite, starless highway of the Sonoran Desert. 12 chapters, 3 distinct nightmares, and one absolute truth: the dark always claims what belongs to it in the end. Until our next transmission, turn off your lights, lock your doors, and keep your eyes on the road. Good night.